Hello, and welcome to the first of hopefully many sporadic videos I will release in the series I have come to call Critical Analysis. In this series, we will have in-depth and competent talks about games in different genres, the game theory behind them, and their designs. This series will also be geared around the subject of failure, not at the corporate or publisher level, but rather at the level of the community and the game design itself. As well, there will be many videos that will pit games up against each other and dissect why one game design works over the other. I hope that is enough of an explanation as to what this series is all about. But first, I should begin by introducing myself. I was going to do an entire video on this, but I decided against it because, well, it seemed to me that it was a bit egotistical and a bit pointless, as I don't really think anyone cares about my story. So I will simply add it to the head note and segue into my first video on this channel and series. I am what I would consider a failed game developer. I've been through 3 years of game development school, learning game theory, writing, storyboarding, coding, artistic measures, the works, and while racking up a rather large amount of debt. This debt was gained with absolutely no breakthrough in the industry, leaving me penniless with zero hard skills in actually making a game from start to finish. And while I could have, and probably should have pushed through these issues and come out the other side an indie developer with something to show for my passion, the process of going through the school I chose to go through had also happened to destroy my love for the industry as a whole. And while I have my discrepancies against the school that I unfortunately chose to attend, I have no one to blame but myself for the situation I find myself in. However, I did not come out of this school with absolutely nothing. Whether it was intentional or not, the school did teach me one thing. I was far better at the writing and concept portions of creating a game than I ever would be at coding, art, or otherwise. While my peers made absolutely gorgeously drawn characters that were very one-dimensional, I had already created an entire world for my game and multi-level deep characters within it, despite being unable to effectively portray those characters in a visual medium. I was bad at drawing. What did this teach me? Well, I'm not an artist. I'm a writer, and I've been writing ever since. I took up an internship for a few different gaming journalism sites and practiced on my own. And I'm here now, doing what I've found I love to do, reviewing games in an honest, fair, and deep method. My end goal for every review is that I hope to provide such insight that no one will be undecided about buying a game after reading it. And that's all about me, really. It's just a normal guy attempting to bring you quality content in an interesting and fun aesthetic that I personally enjoy. I also hope to create an environment where people can share their feelings about games, whether they liked them or whether they didn't, and where people can kind of relax back and there's not so much in the visual medium, meaning that you can kind of just set it up like a podcast and listen while you're playing games. It is you who are the only thing that keep me going in this endeavor. So please do like, subscribe, and please comment constructive criticism about the topic or channel. So without further explaining, let us begin my first episode of Critical Analysis. Mordhau is one of very few games in a very niche genre of games. Known as first-person slasher or first-person melee games, these types of games consist of one major factor that separates them from other games in the first-person genre. They take away almost all ranged combat, forcing players into using swords, shields, spears, and more to do their killing. Needless to say, the design is high-octane, action-packed combat. From Chivalry Medieval Warfare to Mordhau and Valhalla, the first-person slasher genre is quickly growing in popularity as more and more companies throw their names into the hat of the genre. And with Chivalry 2 on the horizon, I thought it would be worth talking about Mordhau, its most direct competitor. Mordhau's rise and fall is an interesting story to say the least. And while it is debated heavily what led to the ultimate downfall of its player base, many people blame one factor in particular, when in fact it is far more likely that the massive loss of numbers in the player base is not directly related to one thing in particular, but rather the compounded effects of a few things. But I'm getting ahead myself here. Let's start at the beginning. Mordhau's launch was almost unheard of in the gaming industry. It had very little to no marketing at launch, meaning that everything drawing people to the game either came directly from another player or from Steam's glorious bosom of nourishment. It's one of the many things I will always bring up when devs decide to ditch Steam for something else, actually. The mere fact of having Steam is, in most cases, completely worth the price they ask for on sales in return. But Mordhau is a particularly special case. It absolutely exploded almost overnight. At one point in its development, Mordhau had almost 46,000 players playing it at any one given time, effectively pushing it up to the top 10 games on Steam for a very, very long time. It even peaked to 60,000 all-time player record 9 months ago. So what are its numbers now? Mordhau currently has an all-time low of about 4,900 players as of the recording of this video, with a player count of 7,000 in a 24-hour period. So what the hell happened? Why did Mordhau go from over 500,000 players at any given time to being lucky to even break 10,000? Well, that's what we're here to talk about. So I wanted to talk about this factor first because it's the simplest to explain. In essence, Mordhau's dev team was far too small and slow to provide content updates necessary to maintain the interest in the game for a large amount of their suddenly massive community. And while some people will understand this, most people will be angry about this. So where do I stand on this topic? Kinda right in the middle, actually. While I understand why the average gamer would be angry about such a thing, I also understand from a perspective that most average gamers do not. In the gaming industry, whether it's journalism, development, testing, or artistic, chances are if you work on a game in the development industry, you have at some point or another come across non-disclosure agreements and non-compete clauses, both of which are designed to protect the company in the event that you decide to leave. And what we are focusing on is specifically the non-compete clause. While most of these NCAs are very, very specific, some of these are purposefully broad, as though to punish the developers in the case that they sever their ties in favor of a better job. Personally, I find these unconstitutional, and I believe that they absolutely should be illegal. Imagine, for instance, that you're a game developer working on a MOBA title. You're underpaid and overworked. Then one day you get an email from a startup MOBA development team that pays more, has a better concept, and really catches your eye. You decide to take the job, looking to the future for yourself and your new team, only to find out that the company's NDA you were forced to sign to even get the job prohibits you from working in the industry for up to a year. And if you do, you could be the subject of a lawsuit. So basically, the company that you decided to work for holds all the cards in your future in the industry and can decide to punish you for trying to better yourself, forcing you out of the industry for an undisclosed amount of time. Basically, although money is plenty, for developers it's not always about the money. It's about the risk to their livelihood and their value in the industry. Because of this, game developers who have proven themselves as competent creators are not so easy to come by as one might think. And while there's plenty more unemployed developers out there, including myself, we have yet to prove ourselves by working on a real project in a real studio, and thusly are quite a high risk for such a small company to take on. I hope this all makes sense, as I'm talking less about the game and more about the industry as a whole. Because of the risks of bringing in people exponentially, studios hire slowly, usually through people they trust, rather than hiring everyone that comes along as they do. Being a game development studio often requires strict security over sensitive information, meaning that background checks are absolutely essential. Because of these things, I can understand why Mordhau's dev team would not simply grow exponentially overnight. However, I do feel at the same time that I should have grown faster than it did. Its slow rate of updates almost makes it feel like the devs had decided to put in minimum effort after having made their massive amounts of money in the large spike for the game. And without the dev team openly coming out and saying anything about it, they kind of just leave the community up to their own devices on exactly what's going on. And most people will come to the conclusion that the dev team just doesn't care, and that they drop the game to move on to different projects. From the very beginning, Mordhau was pushed into competitive gameplay. All of the players came from somewhere, of course, and the good portion of those players were converted over from the dying chivalry medieval warfare. Of those players, a relatively good portion were considered competitive in chivalry. While this community was never very large or had many eyes on it, there was a desire to replicate the competitive gameplay in Mordhau. And unfortunately, it was this desire to replicate that caused its ultimate downfall. For all intents and purposes, it is almost never a bad idea for a community of a game to build a competitive scene around the game they play. In fact, it typically makes the games and their communities last far longer than they originally should have. However, the issue that arose very quickly was that the prospect competitive community of Mordhau wished to replicate Chivalry's competitive community to the T, rather than building a new design based on the game that they were now playing. And I can't stress this enough, Mordhau is not the same as Chivalry. It has different strengths in its design that are very different from Chivalry's own gameplay strengths. Critically speaking, Mordhau's real strength is in the amount of players you can have on the maps and in battles at once. So when it came out that the competitive community was pushing away from grand warfare combat in favor of lower number combat with no range fighting, a lot of people lost interest in really trying, including myself. 6 versus 6 combat in Mordhau is just not as fun to play or watch as frontline 32 versus 32. Now, I was not around for much of the competitive ramp up in Mordhau, as I dipped out relatively soon after realizing the system that the community was trying to build. As a result, I'm not particularly sure of the state of the competitive scene as it currently is. But through a bit of research, I've come to the conclusion that the community is still attempting to hammer in 3v3s and 6v6 game modes in a game that truly excels at 32 versus 32 gameplay. And it's very unfortunate. Needless to say, the division in the community's vision of what a competitive Mordhau should be may have played a large part in exactly why the game's competitive never really took off. And in turn, the community of hardcore players looking for gratification in their matches will begin to look elsewhere. And while there are now places like Venetus Melee pushing for competitive Mordhau, I feel that it might be far too late. The vast majority of the community has already left, and unfortunately, they are very unlikely to come back. And with the competitive designs out of the way, we segue straight into the main point of failure Mordhau has. I don't think anyone will disagree when I say it took way too long for Mordhau to adopt the invasion game mode from Chivalry. And while I can't quite explain it, the game modes and game loop of Mordhau never really feel meaningful or truly rewarding. You get plenty of rewards, of course, coins that you can use to unlock different weapons, armor pieces, and more. Unfortunately, however, this only lasts for so long, and with only a very small amount of customization for each weapon, that time is even shorter than it should be. Beyond unlocking everything you probably won't even use once you find the right weapon for you, there's literally nothing else to do. The only thing that keeps you going in the game is beating your opponents in battle, which only really happens 50% of the time if you're relatively good at the game. More if you're lucky or particularly dedicated to the game. And unfortunately, while Mordhau spent time working on a run-of-the-mill battle royale mode that no one would play, they lost the time they had to put real maps and unlockable content into the game, in turn losing players to the void of the gaming industry. And unfortunately, most of the games I've played in Mordhau were very mundane, as if winning just felt about the same as losing. There's no thrill in victory in Mordhau. The game just kinda ends on most maps. It hinges most of its gameplay on not rewarding the player, but just expecting the player to want to play another round. While this is a problem in a lot of games these days, it's particularly noticeable in Mordhau, especially if you're on the losing side. There's no real reason to keep playing beyond your own love of the game. And with today's social structure in gaming, Unfortunately, that's just not enough. People will move on as fast as they come these days. So what could be done now? Well, personally I believe that Mordhau has one massive strength: its mechanics. These mechanics could either die with the game's community, or they could become something so much greater than the game's own intentions. My thoughts are, right now, there's absolutely nothing to lose by releasing the dev tools and allowing a modding community to grow around the game. Allow us to use these beautiful mechanics to create stories, not unlike Kingdom Come Deliverance or Mount & Blade Warband. They will become created if they are allowed, cutting the need for other players to enjoy the game. Because while they might not be around forever to fill servers, modded missions, stories, and worlds the communities can create will be. This will not only extend their game's half-life exponentially, but it will bring an entirely new community into the fray. The very dedicated and passionate community that continues to hold up Mount & Blade Warband until this very day. Whatever they do, they better hurry. Chivalry 2 is just around the corner, and it poises to wipe out what little community is still left, etching the final letters into the tombstone that expresses one thing: the death of Mordhau. So what do you guys think? Do you think that there's any way to save the game, or is it already too late? Do you think that any of the things that I have stated carry any merit? If not, why? I want to read your comments on this topic, so please do post them. And be sure to like and subscribe for future topics. I'd love to see you there. If you've made it to the end, thank you for watching, thank you for listening, and see you guys in the next one.